We were supposed to start, but this one will be our introductory song to our introducer. Oh, you still do? Okay.
7 more minutes.
We have 7 more minutes, so please go back to your conversations, because when we played in 1956, no one really listened, but they sort of did with one quarter of one ear, and we were all used to that. And Jackie Byard, the great pianist, when he would play at the Village Gate, he used to say, "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for letting me practice." So you have a First Amendment right to have a good time, because back when we did this stuff with Jack, the band always outnumbered the audience, and we always had a good time anyway, and nobody was paying attention, so that's cool too. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we want to introduce, in our remaining 2 minutes, David Dellinger is going to come on in 2 minutes. So since I was supposed to give a 2-minute introduction at the end of the act, I'll do it beforehand, since the other people who don't hear this will phone it in. Just want to thank all of you in the remaining minute and 45 seconds for coming here. And thank you for being here. And just say, when I met Jack in 1956 at a Bring Your Own Bottle party, he had Town in the City, a wonderful book, which later was criticized for being a knockoff of Thomas Wolfe. After he got famous, no one could believe he wrote such a good book to begin with. And we were at a Bring Your Own Bottle party. He handed me 2 pieces of paper, dressed up in a plaid shirt, looking like a Canadian lumberjack out of work at the moment, and said, "Play for me." Then he took the paper back before I could see what it was, and he began to read, and I had just finished playing with Charles Mingus, and I had no idea what he was doing, but it just felt so good, and I didn't know if he was freestyling or if he was reading something by Victor Hugo or Gregory Corso or himself, but it was beautiful. And then he ran off dancing with someone, and I ran around and kept meeting him and bumping into him. And then I finally found out his name, and he said he was a writer, and I told him I was a classical composer and a jazz musician, which was even more hopeless at that time. And we became friends, and then we started doing him reading anything or making up something, and my accompanying him. And we did that for months at different people's parties, or abandoned Burger King at 3 in the morning when they were called something else. And we had a good time until we were told to knock it off. And eventually they decided to have a formal jazz poetry reading, and we went around to coffee houses, and about 30 people showed up. And then the Circle in the Square Theater asked us to do something, and suddenly, jazz poetry. And because he'd written an amazingly good book, which the Third String Critic gave a phenomenal review to, called On the Road, and suddenly he was a famous person overnight, but he did not wear a tweed coat with patches on his sleeve, have a fake English accent, and start snubbing everybody, becoming a tenured professor at university, having a nervous breakdown, and portraying his role in his newfound class, which he didn't want to be part of in the first place, and remained himself, true to himself, which of course is a fatal thing to do if you're in a certain way of thinking about what you're supposed to do in life. So a year later, he committed the greatest crime you can in America. He fell out of fashion. And most of the people who jumped on that gravy train jumped off of it. But the word Beat Generation became a morbid, disgusting, depressing, anti-human, unliterary, unmusical, moronic, slobitissimo state to allow all people who despised art and artists to feel comfortable by having a slot, a special outhouse that we were provided to lump people together so that they could be in a miserable state. So this is the first time in this festival in 65 years where Jack has been honored as an artist. He used to always say, "I'm an author. Why don't they read my books? I'm an author." He had that Lowell accent. "I'm an author, Davy. I'm a writer." And now, whole new generation who was never around in the 1940s when he wrote about On the Road from 47 to 49 are reading his books. And like Don Quixote, we don't joust with windmills anymore, but Don Quixote and Sancho Panza are still current, still relevant, because they're great stories by a great writer. And Jack is the same way. It's so nice that in 2022, this is a chance to acknowledge him. And also, the final thing, he called me up one night and he said, "Man, you won't believe it. Charles Laughton, the great English actor, was reading my book from The Lonesome Traveler, and I heard him on the radio." So it's not necessary to have someone who never learned how to speak trippingly on the tongue, as Shakespeare said, to be able to do his stuff. You don't have to mumble, scream, and foam at the mouth. So you'll notice that when these readers are reading, they're all great actors. They're artists themselves, and they're recreating Jack's words on paper and making them alive. Shakespeare, as you know, and I worked for Shakespeare in the Park for 12 years, wrote on the paper, to be or not to be, that's the question. However, there's a much better way of doing it, and it takes a great actors, to make that come alive, and every actor does it differently, and they're all beautiful because they're personal. And it's the same thing with composing music, and it's the same thing with writing a book. So we're going to hear Jack's voice, and we're going to play very softly, so these people from HB Studios, which is concentrated on acting as an art form, not just a business, will be able to express themselves, and we're there quietly, not getting in the way, accompanying them so they can ignore us and soar. So thank you for coming, and I think that's more than 2 minutes. Now that
Yeah, I just want to say that I am honored that everybody's here, but also especially Mr. Amram to be here, who had such a deep connection with the material. Yeah, it's amazing, right? I'm David as well. I'm David Deblinger, and I actually was thinking I would start by sharing just a little bit about why, when I was asked to put together a reading of this book, I was like, yes! Basically, I got to read for the first time on the road in college, and at that same period, I experienced something else that had both directly to do with the book and indirectly. In college, I had a large Jew fro, like horizontally, and I also had this roommate named Neil who was obsessed with, specifically, he was obsessed with looking for, finding, and trying LSD. And because I had long hair, he was like, David, you could go find the people, come on! And it just so happened that day, I was in the library, and there were these two guys with longer hair than mine, and I just was like, you don't know where I could get some acid? And they're like, we have some right now. You want to buy it? And I did, but I had a paper due, and it was actually probably about on the road. So when I went to Neil, I was like, all right, Neil, listen, I found out where we can get it. And he's like, call them! And I was like, listen, you have to promise that you're okay, because I have a paper due. So you have to promise that you're okay with doing it alone. And he's like, okay. So I take it out of my pocket, I put it on the table. Maybe you could go up a little bit. And he's like, and my girlfriend Susie at the time is there, another roommate Walt. Neil picks it up, a little piece of paper, puts it on his tongue, and we're just looking at him, and there's that thought, can you take the trip and not come back, go crazy or something? So we're just looking at him, and then we're like, okay, let's go get pizza. We go get pizza. So we go and get pizza, and when we're eating the pizza, they cut the pie where there was just like a very small kind of triangle in the corner. And Neil starts looking at that triangle, and he picks it up and he starts laughing, but he doesn't just laugh from his mouth and face. His wrist starts going like this, and just the same words just keep coming out of his mouth, and he's like, it's so simple. It's so simple. It's so simple. And we look at each other and we're like, okay, we gotta go try this right now. Anyway, I won't go into the whole thing, but at one point I remembered the book I was reading, and it was like a bomb went off in my brain, and I just started talking, and I stood up on a chair, and I was shouting, and we all started crying, and I remember we all said, this was not bullshit. This was not bullshit. What happened today was not bullshit. And then the next day, I woke up and I just still was in a very positive place. like everything was going to be okay. But my girlfriend had a little bit of a panic attack. Her sister was pregnant, whatever. And we went into my bedroom, my room, and we just looked out the window, and there was a light rain. And Susie was next to me, and we just looked, and I just was like, check it out, the rain dripping off the leaves. Check it out. The birds, the wind, check it out. Check it out. And we both just chilled. And it was really beautiful. And I just felt, and I felt so grateful for everything. And to be honest, I feel grateful today to you. Everyone in the room. There's an idea in the book of looking for what's sacred. There's also an idea that theater and listening to stories, people live doing that, is sacred. So before we start, I actually want to do something a little, just slightly weird with you, where I invite you something, but nobody has to do it. I'm going to do something now, and then after the intermission, which will be 10 minutes after 4 readers read. Right now, what I want you to do is, first, I want to ask you, when you hear all this reading of the book, and again, I think part of it deals with the sacred, with searching for the sacred. Just if there's any moments from your life, like specific moments that pop up in your mind that you see as sacred, just notice them. And the second thing, and this might sound weird, but all I want to do, since we're together in this room right now, I'm just wondering if you don't have to say anything, well, could you just for a second, could you just look at the people sitting next to you, just look at them and just sort of acknowledge that these people are next to you, and maybe go a little like that or whatever, that there's people next to you, and maybe that we could say that everybody in this room, not just the performers, matters. So that's it. So now I'm not going, the only way I'm going to introduce each reader is by saying their name. And FYI, I have actually invited the readers, besides reading, if they want to share why they decided to do this. I've invited that, but they may or may not. And then besides that, again, there'll be an intermission. I'll say each name, and then we'll have this unbelievable musicians so connected to this material playing. So we'll start off, thank you so much all of you for being here. We'll start off with, ladies and gentlemen, Mercedes Ruehl.
I'm going to read now, talk later. I first met Dean not long after my wife and I split up. I had just gotten over a serious illness that I won't bother to talk about, except that it had something to do with the miserably weary split up and my feeling that everything was dead. With the coming of Dean Moriarty began a part of my life that you could call my life on the road. Before this, I'd often dreamed of going west to see the country, always vaguely planning and never taking off. Dean is the perfect guy for the road because he actually was born on the road when his parents were passing through Salt Lake City in 1926 in a jalopy on their way to Los Angeles. First reports of him came to me through Chad King, who'd shown me a few letters from him written in a New Mexico reform school. I was tremendously interested in the letters because they so naively and sweetly asked Chad to teach him all about Nietzsche and all the wonderful intellectual things that Chad knew. At one point, Carlo and I talked about the letters and wondered if we would ever meet the strange Dean Moriarty. This is all far back, when Dean was not the way he is today, when he was a young jail kid, shrouded in mystery. Then came the news that Dean was out of reform school and was heading to New York for the first time. Also, there was talk that he had just married a girl called Mary Lou. One day, I was hanging out around the campus and Chad and Tim Gray told me that Dean was staying at a cold water pad in East Harlem, the Spanish Harlem. Dean had arrived the night before, the first time in New York, with his beautiful little sharp chick, Mary Lou. They got off the Greyhound bus at 50th Street and cut around the corner looking for a place to eat and went right into Hector's. And since then, Hector's Cafeteria has always been a big symbol of New York for Dean. They spent money on big, beautiful glazed cakes and cream puffs. All this time, Dean was telling Mary Lou things like, "Now, darling, here we are in New York, and although I haven't quite told you everything that I was thinking about when we crossed Missouri, especially at the point where we passed Boonville Reformatory, which reminded me of my jail problem, it is absolutely necessary now to postpone all those leftover things concerning our personal love things and at once begin thinking of specific work-life plans," and so on and so forth in the way that he had in those days. I went to the cold water flat with the boys, and Dean came to the door in his shorts. Mary Lou was jumping off the couch. Dean probably, dispatched the other occupant of the apartment to the kitchen, probably to make coffee, while he proceeded with his love problems, for to him, sex was the one and only holy and important thing in life, although he had to sweat and curse to make a living and so on and so forth. You saw that in the way he stood, bobbing his head, always looking down, nodding like a young boxer to instructions to make you think he was listening to every word, throwing in 1,000 yeses and that's rights. And my first impression of Dean was of a young Gene Autry, trim, thin-hipped, blue-eyed, with a real Oklahoma accent, a side-burned hero of the snowy West. In fact, he had just been working on a ranch, Ed Walls, in Colorado, before marrying Mary Lou and coming east. Mary Lou was a pretty blonde with immense ringlets of hair like a sea of golden tresses. She sat there on the edge of the couch with her hands hanging in her lap and her smoky blue country eyes fixed in a wide stare because she was in an evil gray New York pad that she'd heard about back west and waiting like a long-bodied, emaciated Modigliani surrealistic woman in a serious room. But outside of being a sweet little girl, she was awfully dumb and capable of doing horrible things. That night, we all drank beer and pulled wrists and talked till dawn, and in the morning, while we sat around dumbly smoking butts out of ashtrays in the gray light of a gloomy day, Dean got nervously. He got up and paced around thinking and decided the thing to do was to have Mary Lou make breakfast and sweep the floor. "In other words, we gotta get on the ball, darling. I'm saying otherwise we'll be fluctuating and lack of true knowledge or crystallization of our plans." Then I went away. During the following week, he confided in Chad King that he absolutely had to learn how to write from him. And Chad said I was the one that he should come to for advice, for writing advice. Meanwhile, Dean had gotten a job in a parking lot, had a fight with Mary Lou in their Hoboken apartment, God knows why they went there, and she was so mad and so deep down vindictive that she reported to the police some false, trumped-up, hysterical, crazy charge, and Dean had to lam it out of Hoboken. So, He had no place to live, came right out to Paterson, New Jersey, where I was living with my aunt, and this was one night when I was studying. There was a knock at the door, and there was Dean, bowing and shuffling obsequiously in the dark hall and saying, "Hello. You remember me, Dean Moriarty? I've come to ask you to show me how to write." "And where's Mary Lou?" I asked, and Dean said she apparently whored a few dollars together and got back to Denver, the whore. So we went out to have a few beers because we couldn't talk like we wanted to talk in front of my aunt, who sat in the living room reading her paper. She took one look at Dean and decided that he was a madman. In the bar, I told Dean, "Hell, man, I know very well you didn't come here only to learn to be a writer, and after all, what do I really know about it except you gotta stick to it with all the energy of a Benny addict?" And he said, "Yeah, of course, I know exactly what you mean. And in fact, all those problems have occurred to me. But the thing that I want is the realization of some factors that should, one, depend on Schopenhauer's dichotomy for any inwardly realized," and so on. So on in that way, things I understood not a bit, and he himself didn't. In those days, he really didn't know what he was talking about. That is to say, he was a young jail kid all hung up on the wonderful possibilities of becoming a real intellectual, and he liked to talk in the tone and using the words, but in a jumbled way that he had heard from real intellectuals. Although, mind you, he wasn't so naive that in all the other things, and it took him a few months with Carlo Marx to become completely in there with all the terms and the jargon. Nevertheless, we understood each other on other levels of madness, and I agreed that he could stay in my house till he found a job, and furthermore, we agreed to go west sometime. That was in the winter of 1947. One night, when Dean ate supper at my house, he already had the parking lot job in New York, he leaned over my shoulder as I typed rapidly away and said, "Come on, man, those girls won't wait, make it fast." And I said, "Hold on just a minute. I'll be right with you as soon as I finish this chapter." And it was one of the best chapters in the book. And then I dressed, and off we went to New York to meet some girls. As we rode in the bus in the weird phosphorescent void of the Lincoln Tunnel, we leaned on each other with fingers waving and yelled and talked excitedly, and I was beginning to get the bug like Dean. He was simply a youth, tremendously excited with life. And though he was a con man, he was really only conning because he wanted so much to live and get involved with people who would otherwise pay no attention to him. He was conning me, and I knew it, for the room and the board and the how to write, etc. And he knew I knew it. This has been the basis of our relationship. But I didn't care. And when we just got along fine, no pestering, no catering. We just tiptoed around each other like heartbreaking new friends. I began to learn from him as much as he probably learned from me. As far as my work was concerned, he'd say, "Go ahead, everything you do is great." He'd watch over my shoulder as I wrote stories yelling, "Yes, that's right! Wow, man!" and "Phew!" and wiped his face with his handkerchief. "Man, wow, there's so many things to do, there's so many things to write. How to even begin to get it all down and without modified restraints and all hung up on like literary inhibitions and grammatical fears. That's right, man, now you're talking." And a kind of holy lightning I saw flashing from his excitement and his visions when he described so torrentially that people in the buses looked around to see who was the overexcited nut. In the West, he'd spent a third of his time in the pool hall, a third in jail, and a third in the public library. They'd see him rushing eagerly down the winter streets, bareheaded, carrying books to the pool hall, or climbing trees to get into the attics of buddies so that he could spend days reading or hiding from the law. We went to New York. I forget what the situation was. 2 colored girls. There were no girls there. They were supposed to meet him in a diner, but they didn't show up. So we went to his parking lot, and there he had a few things to do. He changed his clothes in the shack out back and spruced up a little in front of a cracked mirror, so on and so forth, and then we took off. And that was the night Dean met Carlo Marx. A tremendous thing happened when Dean met Carlo Marx. Two keen minds that they are, they took to each other at the drop of a hat. Two piercing eyes glancing into two other piercing eyes, the holy con man with the shining mind and the sorrowful poetic con man with the dark mind that is Carlo Marx. From that moment on, I saw very little of Dean, and I was a little sorry too. Their energies met head on. I was a lout compared. I couldn't keep up with them. The whole mad swirl of everything that was to come began right then. It would mix up all my friends and all I had of family in a big dust cloud over the American night. Carlo told him of old Bull Lee, Elmer Hassel, Jane, Lee in Texas growing weed, Hassel on Rikers Island, Jane wandering on Times Square in a benzodrine hallucination with her baby girl in her arms ending up in Bellevue. And Dean told Carlo of unknown people in the West like Tommy Snark, the club-footed pool hall rotation shark and card player and queer saint. He told him of Roy Johnson, Big Ed Dunkel, his boyhood buddies, his street buddies, his innumerable girls and sex parties and pornographic pictures, his heroes, heroines, adventures. They rushed down the street together, digging everything in the early way they had, which later became so much sadder and perceptive and blank. But then they danced down the street like dingle doties, and I shambled after as I've been doing all my life after people who interest me, because the only people for me are the mad ones, the ones who are mad to live, mad to talk, mad to be saved, desirous of everything at the same time, the ones who never yawn or say a commonplace thing, but burn, 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 like fabulous yellow Roman candles exploding like spiders across the stars, and in the middle you see the blue center light pop and everybody goes, ah! Wanting dearly to learn how to write like Carlo, the first thing you know, Dean was attacking him with a great amorous soul, such as only a con man has. Now, Carlo, let me speak. Here's what I'm saying. I didn't see them for about 2 weeks, during which time they cemented their friendship to fiendish all day, all night talk proportions. And then came spring, the great time of traveling. Everybody in that scattered gang was getting ready to take one trip or another. I was busily at work on my novel, and when I came to the halfway mark, after a trip down south with my aunt to visit my brother Rocco, I got ready to travel west for the very first time. Dean had already left. Carlo and I saw him off at the 34th Street Greyhound station. Upstairs, they had a place where you could take pictures for a quarter. Carlo took off his glasses and looked sinister. Dean made a profile shot and looked coyly around. I took a straight picture that made me look like a 30-year-old Italian who'd kill anybody who said anything against his mother. This picture Carlo and Dean neatly cut down the middle with a razor and saved a half each in their wallets. Dean was wearing a real Western business suit for his big trip back. Back to Denver he was going. He'd finished his first fling in New York. I say fling, but he only worked like a dog in parking lots. The most fantastic parking lot attendant in the world. He can back a car 40 miles an hour into a tight squeeze and stop at the wall, jump out, race among the fenders, leap into another car, circle at 50 miles an hour in a narrow space, back swiftly into a tight spot, hump, snap the car with an emergency so that you could see it bounce as he flies out, then clear the ticket jack, sprinting like a track star, hand the ticket, leap into a new newly arrived car before the owner's half out, leap literally under him as he steps out, start the car with the door flapping, a roar off to the next available spot, arc, pop in, brake, out, run, working like that without pause 8 hours a night, evening rush hours and after theater rush hours, in greasy wino pants with a frayed fur jacket and a beat shoe that flapped. Now, he bought a new suit to go back in, blue with pencil stripes, a vest and all, $11 on 3rd Avenue, with a watch and a watch chain and a portable typewriter with which he was going to start writing in a Denver rooming house as soon as he got a job there. We had farewell meal of Franks and beans in a 7th Avenue Rikers, and then Dean got on the bus that said Chicago and roared off into the night. There went our Wrangler. I promised myself to go the same way when spring really bloomed and opened up the land. And this was really the way that my whole road experience began. And things that were to come are too fantastic not to tell. Yes, and it wasn't only because I was a writer and needed new experiences that I wanted to know Dean more, and because my life hanging around the campus had reached the completion of its cycle and was stultified, but because somehow, in spite of our difference in character, he reminded me of some long-lost brother. The sight of his suffering, bony face with the long sideburns and his straining, muscular, sweaty neck made me remember my boyhood in those dye dumps and swim holes and riversides and Patterson and in the Passaic. His dirty work clothes clung to him so gracefully as though you couldn't buy a better outfit from a custom tailor, but only earn it from the natural tailor of natural joy, as Dean had in all his stresses. And in his excited way of speaking, I heard again the voices of old companions and brothers under the bridge, among the motorcycles along the wash line neighborhood, and drowsy doorsteps of afternoons where boys played guitars and their older brothers worked in the mills. All my other current friends were intellectuals. Chad, the Nietzschean anthropologist, Carlo Marx in his nutty, surrealist, low-voiced, serious, staring talk, Old Bull Lee in his critical, anti-everything drawl, or else they were slinking criminals like Elmer Hassel with that hip sneer, Jane Lee with the same, sprawled out on the oriental cover of her couch, sniffing at a New Yorker. But Dean's intelligence was every bit as formal and shining and complete, without the tedious intellectualness. His criminality was not something that sulked and sneered. It was a wild, yea-saying overburst of American joy. It was Western. It was the West Wind, an ode from the plains, something new, long prophesied, long a-comin'. He only stole cars for joyrides. Besides, all my New York friends were in the negative, nightmare position of putting down society and giving them tired, bookish and political and psychological reasons. But Dean just raced in society, eager for bread and love. He didn't care one way or the other, so long as I can get that little old gal with that little something down there between her legs, boy. And so long as we can eat, son, you hear me? I'm hungry, I'm starving, let's eat right now. And off we would rush to eat, whereof, as it saith in Ecclesiastes, it is your portion under the sun. A Western kinsman, Dean. Although my aunt warned me that he would get me into trouble, I could hear a new call and see a new horizon and believe it at my age. And a little bit of trouble, or even Dean's eventual rejection of me as a buddy, putting me down as he would do later on starving sidewalks and sick beds. What did it matter? I was a young writer and I wanted to take off. Somewhere along that line, I knew there'd be girls, visions, everything. Somewhere along the line, the pearl would be handed to me. I tried to get some of the enthusiasm that I felt when I first read this at 20. You know, and it wasn't just enthusiasm to meet guys like this. It was because it was in my soul too. All these excitements and thrills and needing to start out on a life of adventure. And many years later, I had my own 2 sons, and I learned further and more deeply about the poetry of young men, about the things they'll tell you and the things they keep to themselves. There is an endless beauty in the poetry of young men. It's so, and has been such an honor and so much fun to encounter it again in all its lively enthusiasm for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This book became an obsession for me for about 2 years when I was honored to be asked to write the film version of On the Road. And the movie is what it is. But I really fell in love with this book. Its beauty, its power, and its flaws, of which there are many. You know, I could not say no when David asked me, so that's why I'm here. Thank you, David. I left everybody and went home to rest. My aunt said I was wasting my time hanging around with Dean and his gang. I knew that was wrong too. Life is life, and kind is kind. What I wanted was to take one more magnificent trip to the West and get back in time for the spring semester at school. And what a trip it turned out to be. I only went along for the ride and to see what else Dean was going to do. And finally, also knowing Dean would go back to Camille in Frisco, I wanted to have an affair with Mary Lou. We got ready to cross the groaning continent again. I drew my GI check and gave Dean $18 to mail to his wife. She was waiting for him to come home, and she was broke. What was on Mary Lou's mind, I don't know. Ed Dunkel, as ever, just followed. There were long, funny days spent in Carlo's apartment before we left. He went around in his bathrobe and made semi-ironical speeches. Now, I'm not going to take your hinkty sweets away from you, but it seems to me the time has come to decide what you are and what you're going to do. Carlo was working as a typist in an office. I want to know what all this sitting around this house all day is intended to mean, what all this talk is, and what you propose to do. Dean, why did you leave Camille and pick up Mary Lou? No answer, giggles. Mary Lou, why are you traveling around the country with this, and what are your womanly intentions concerning the shroud? Same answer. Ed Dunkel, why did you abandon your new wife in Tucson, and what are you doing sitting here on your big fat ass? Where's your home? What's your job? Ed Dunkel bowed his head in genuine befuddlement. Sal, how comes it you've fallen on such sloppy days? And what have you done with Lucille? He adjusted his bathrobe and sat facing us. The days of wrath are yet to come, he said. The balloon won't sustain you much longer. And not only that, but it's an abstract balloon. You'll all go flying to the West Coast and come staggering back in search of your stone. In those days, Carlo had developed a tone of voice, which he had hoped sounded like what he called the voice of the rock. The whole idea was to stun people into the realization of the rock. You pin a dragon on your hats, he warned us. You're up in the attic with the bats. His mad eyes glittered at us. Since the Dakar doldrums, or the Harlem doldrums, when he lived in Harlem in midsummer, and at night woke up in his lonely room and heard the great machine descending from the sky. And when he walked on 125th Street underwater with all the other fish. It was a riot of radiant ideas that had come in to enlighten his brain. He made Mary Lou sit on his lap and commanded her to subside. He told Dean, "Why don't you just sit down and relax? Why do you jump around so much?" Dean ran around, putting sugar in his coffee and saying, "Yes, yes, yes." At night, Ed Dunkel slept on the floor on cushions. Dean and Mary Lou pushed Carlo out of the bed, and Carlo sat up in the kitchen over his kidney stew, mumbling the predictions of the rock. I came in days and watched everything. Ed Dunkel said to me, "Last night, I walked clear down to Times Square, and just as I arrived, I suddenly realized I was a ghost. It was my ghost walking on the sidewalk." He said these things to me without comment, nodding his head empathically. 10 hours later, in the midst of someone else's conversation, Ed Dunkel would say, "Yep, it was my ghost walking on the sidewalk." Suddenly, Dean leaned into me earnestly and said, "Sal, I have something to ask of you, very important to me. I wonder how you'll take it. We're buddies, right?" "Sure are, Dean." He almost blushed. Finally, he came out, and he said he wanted me to work Mary Lou. I didn't ask him why, because I knew he wanted to see what Mary Lou was like with another man. We were sitting at Ritzy's bar when he proposed the idea. We'd spent an hour walking Times Square looking for hassle. Ritzy's bar is the hoodlum bar of the streets around Times Square. It changes names every year. You walk in there and you don't see a single girl, even in the booths, just a great mob of young men dressed in all varieties of hoodlum cloth, from red shirts to zoot suits. It was also the hustlers' bar, the boys who made a living among the sad old homos of 8th Avenue night. Dean walked in there with his eyes slitted to see every single face. There were wild Negro queers, sullen guys with guns, shiv-pacting seamen, thin, non-committal junkies, and an occasional well-dressed, middle-aged detective, posing as a bookie and hanging around half for interest and half for duty. It was the typical place for Dean to put down his request. All kinds of evil plans are hatched at Ritzy's bar. You can sense it in the air, and all kinds of mad sexual routines are initiated to go with them. The safecracker proposes not only a certain loft on 14th Street to the hoodlum, but that they sleep together. Kinsey spent a lot of time in Ritzy's bar, interviewing some of the boys. I was there the night his assistant came in 1945. Hassel and Carlo were interviewed. Dean and I drove back to the pad and found Mary Lou in bed. Dunkel was roaming his ghost around New York. Dean told her what we decided. She said she was pleased. I wasn't so sure myself. I had to prove that I'd go through with it. The bed had been the deathbed of a very big man and sagged in the middle. Mary Lou lay there with Dean and myself on each side of her, poised on the up-jutting mattress ends, not knowing what to say. I said, "Oh, hell, I can't do this." "Go on, man, you promised," said Dean. "Well, what about Mary Lou?" I said. "Come on, Mary Lou, what do you think?" "Go ahead," she said. She embraced me, and I tried to forget old Dean was there. Every time I realized he was there in the dark, listening for every sound, I couldn't do anything but laugh. It was horrible. "We must all relax," said Dean. "I'm afraid I can't make it. Why don't you go in the kitchen a minute?" Dean did so. Mary Lou was so lovely, but I whispered, "Wait until we be lovers in San Francisco. My heart isn't in it." I was right, she could tell. It was 3 children of the earth trying to decide something in the night and having all the weight of past centuries ballooning in the dark before them. There was a strange quiet in the apartment. I went and tapped Dean and told him to go to Mary Lou, and I retired to the couch. I could hear Dean blissful and blabbering and frantically rocking. Only a guy who spent 5 years in jail can go to such maniacal, helpless extremes, beseeching at the portals of the soft source, mad with a completely physical realization of the origins of life bliss, blindly seeking to return the way he came. This was the result of years looking at sexy pictures behind bars, looking at the legs and breasts of women in popular magazines, evaluating the hardness of the steel walls and the softness of the woman who was not there. Prison is where you promise yourself the right to live. Dean had never seen his mother's face. Every new girl, every new wife, every new child was an addition to his bleak impoverishment. Where was his father? Old bum Dean Moriarty, the tinsmith, riding freights, working as a scullion in railroad cook shacks, stumbling, down crashing in wino alley nights, expiring on coal piles, dropping his yellow teeth one by one in the gutters of the West. Dean had every right to die the sweet deaths of complete love of his Mary Lou. I didn't want to interfere. I just wanted to follow. Carlo came back at dawn and put on his bathrobe. He wasn't sleeping very much those days. "Ack!" he cried. He was going out of his mind from the confusion of jam on the floor, pants, dresses thrown around, cigarette butts, dirty dishes, open books. It was a great forum we were having. Every day the world groaned to turn and we were making our appalling studies of the night. Mary Lou was black and blue from a fight with Dean about something. His face was scratched. It was time to go. We drove to my house, a whole gang of 10, to get my bag and call old Bull Lee in New Orleans from the phone in the bar, where Dean and I had our first talk years ago, when he came to my door to learn to write. We heard Bull's whining voice 1,800 miles away. "Say, what do you boys expect me to do with this Galatea Dunkel?" She'd been there 2 weeks now, hiding in her room, refusing to talk to either Jane or me. "Have you got this character Ed Dunkel with you? For Christ's sakes, bring him down and get rid of her. She's sleeping on our best bedroom and run clear out of money. This ain't no hotel." We assured Bull, with whoops and cries over the phone. There was Dean, Mary Lou, Carlo, Dunkel, me, Ian MacArthur's wife, Tom Saybrook, God knows who else, all yelling and drinking beers over the phone at befuddled Bull, who above all things hated confusion. "Well," he said, "maybe it'll make better sense when you get down here, if you gets down here." I said goodbye to my aunt and promised to be back in 2 weeks and took off for California again.
I knew about this book for years, and I had never read it. And I wanted to do this reading to force myself to read it. And I was mesmerized. I so encourage you, if you've never read it, you really must. It is music. It is the most original voice, and it's just thrilling to read. And I think even if you've already read it, it's worth a second read. It's a great book. It was drizzling and mysterious at the beginning of our journey. I could see that it was all going to be one big saga of the mist. "Woo-wee!" yelled Dean. "Here we go!" And he hunched over the wheel and gunned her. He was back in his element. Everybody could see that. We were all delighted. We all realized we were leaving confusion and nonsense behind and performing our one and noble function of the time, move. And we moved. We flashed past the mysterious white signs of the night somewhere in New Jersey that said south with an arrow and west with an arrow, and took the south one. New Orleans. It burned in our brains. From the dirty snows of frosty Fagtown, New York, as Dean called it, all the way to the greeneries and river smells of old New Orleans at the washed-out bottom of America. Then west. Ed was in the back seat, Mary Lou and Dean and I sat in front and had the warmest talk about the goodness and joy of life. Dean suddenly became tender. Now, damn it, look here, all of you. We all must admit that everything is fine and there's no need in the world to worry. And in fact, we should realize what it would mean to us to understand that we're not really worried about anything. Am I right? We all agreed. And here we go, we're all together. What did we do in New York? Let's forgive. We all had our spats back then. That's behind us, merely by miles and inclinations. Now we're heading down to New Orleans to dig Old Bull Lee. And ain't that gonna be a kick? And listen, will you, to this old tenor man blow his top. He shot up the radio volume till the car shuddered, and listened to him till the story and put down true relaxation and knowledge. We all jumped to the music and agreed. The purity of the road, the white line in the middle of the highway unrolled and hugged our left front tire as if glued to our groove. Dean hunched his muscular neck, t-shirted in the winter night, and blasted the car along. He insisted I drive through Baltimore for traffic practice. That was all right, except he and Mary Lou insisted on steering while they kissed and fooled around. It was crazy. The radio was on full blast. Dean beat drums on the dashboard till a great sag developed in it. I did too. The poor Hudson, the slow boat to China, was receiving her beating. Oh man, what kicks, yelled Dean. Now Mary Lou, listen really honey, you know that I'm hot rock capable of anything and doing everything at the same time, and I have unlimited energy. Now in San Francisco, we must go on living together. I know just the place for you. At the end of the regular chain gang run, I'll be home just a cut hair less than every 2 days and for 12 hours at a stretch. And man, you know what we can do in 12 hours, darling. Meanwhile, I'll go right on living at Camille's like nothing, see? She won't know. We can work it. We've done it before. Well, it was all right with Mary Lou. She was really out for Camille's scalp. The understanding had been that Mary Lou would switch to me in Frisco, but I now began to see they were going to stick, and I was going to be left alone on my butt at the other end of the continent. But why think about that when all the golden land's ahead of you and all kinds of unforeseen events wait, lurking to surprise you and make you glad you're alive to see? We arrived in Washington at dawn. It was the day of Harry Truman's inauguration for his second term. Great displays of war might were lined along Pennsylvania Avenue as we rolled by with our battered boat. There were B-59s, PT boats, artillery, all kinds of war material that looked murderous in the snowy grass. The last thing was a regular, small, ordinary lifeboat that looked pitiful and foolish. Dean slowed down to look at it. He kept shaking his head in awe. What are these people up to? Harry's sleeping somewhere in this town, good old Harry, man from Missouri as I am. Why, that must be his own boat. Dean went to sleep in the back seat and Dunkel drove. We gave him specific instructions to take it easy, No sooner were we snoring than he gunned the car up to 80, bad bearings and all, and not only that, he made a triple pass at a spot where a cop was arguing with a motorist. He was in the 4th lane of a 4th lane highway going the wrong way. Naturally, the cop took after us with his siren whining. We were stopped. He told us to follow him to the station house. There was a mean cop in there who took an immediate dislike to Dean. He could smell jail all over him. He sent his cohort outdoors to question Mary Lou and me privately. They wanted to know how old Mary Lou was. They were trying to whip up a Mann Act idea, but she had her marriage certificate. Then they took me aside alone and wanted to know who was sleeping with Mary Lou. Her husband, I said quite simply. They were curious. Something was fishy. They tried some amateur Sherlocking by asking the same questions twice, expecting us to make a slip. I said, "Those two fellas are going back to work on the railroad in California. This is the short one's wife, and I'm a friend on a 2-week vacation from college." The cop smiled and said, "Yeah, is this really your own wallet?" Finally, the mean one inside fined Dean $25. We told them we only had 40 to go all the way to the coast. They said that made no difference to them. When Dean protested, the mean cop threatened to take him back to Pennsylvania and slap a special charge on him. "What charge?" Dean asked. "Never mind what charge. Don't worry about that, wise guy," the cop said. We had to give them the 25. But first, Ed Dunkel, that culprit, offered to go to jail. Now, Dean considered it. The cop was infuriated. He said, "If you let your partner go to jail, I'm taking you back to Pennsylvania right now. You hear that?" All we wanted to do was go. "Another speeding ticket in Virginia and you lose your car," said the mean cop as a parting volley. Dean was red in the face. We drove off silently. It was just like an invitation to steal, to take our trip money away from us. They knew we were broke, and that we had no relatives on the road or to wire for some money. The American police are involved in psychological warfare against those Americans who don't frighten them with imposing papers and threats. It's a Victorian police force. It peers out of musty windows and wants to inquire about everything and can make crimes of the crimes don't exist to its satisfaction. 9 lines of crime, 1 of Borden, said Louis Ferdinand Saline. Dean was so mad, he wanted to come back to Virginia and shoot the cop as soon as he had a gun. "Pennsylvania," he scoffed. "I wish I knew what that charge was. Bag, probably. Take all my money and charge me bag. Those guys have it so damn easy, they'll out and shoot you if you even complain, too." There was nothing to do but get happy with ourselves again and forget about it. When we got through Richmond, we began forgetting about it, and soon everything was okay. Now, we had $15 to go all the way. We'd have to pick up hitchhikers, bum quarters off them for gas. And in Virginia wilderness, suddenly we saw a man walking on the road. Dean zoomed to a stop. I looked back and said he was only a bum and probably didn't have a cent. "We'll pick him up for kicks," Dean laughed. The man was a ragged, bespectacled, mad type, walking along, reading a paperback muddy book he'd found in a culvert by the road. He got in the car and went right on reading. He was incredibly filthy and covered with scabs. He said his name was Hyman Solomon and that he walked all over the USA, knocking and sometimes kicking at Jewish doors and demanding money. "Give me money to eat. I am a Jew." He said it worked very well and that it was coming to him. We asked him what he was reading. Oh, he didn't know. He didn't bother to look at the title page. He was only looking at the words, as though he had found the real Torah where it belonged, in the wilderness. "See, see, see," cackled Dean, poking my ribs. "I told you it was kicks. Everybody's kicks, man." We carried Solomon all the way to Testament. My brother by now was in his new house on the other side of town. Here we were, back on the long, bleak street with a railroad track running down the middle and the sad sullen Southerners loping in front of hardware stores in 5s and 10s. Solomon said, "I see you people need a little money to continue your journey. You wait for me, I'll go hustle up a few dollars at the Jewish home and I'll go along with you as far as Alabama." Well, Dean was all beside himself with happiness. He and I rushed off to buy bread and cheese spread for a lunch in the car. Mary Lou and Ed waited in the car. We spent 2 hours in Testament waiting for Hyman Solomon to show up. He was hustling for his bread somewhere in town, but we couldn't see him. The sun began to grow red and late. Solomon never showed up, so we roared out of Testament. Now you see, Sal, God does exist because we keep getting hung up with this town, no matter what we try to do. And you'll notice the strange biblical name of it and that strange biblical character who made us stop here once more, and all things tied together all over like rain, connecting everybody the world over by chain touch. Dean rattled on like this. He was overjoyed and exuberant. He and I suddenly saw the whole country like an oyster for us to open, and the pearl was there. The pearl was there. Off we roared south. We picked up another hitchhiker. This was a sad young kid who said he had an aunt who owned a grocery store in Dunn, North Carolina, right outside Fayetteville. "When we get there, can you bum a buck off her?" "Right, fine, let's go," said Dean. We were in Dunn in an hour at dusk. We drove to where the kid said his aunt had the grocery store. It was a sad little street that dead-ended at a factory wall. There was a grocery store, but there was no aunt. We wondered what the kid was talking about. We asked him how far he was going. He said he didn't know. It was a big hoax. Once upon a time, in some lost back alley adventure, he had seen the grocery store in Dunn, and it was the first story that popped into his disordered, feverish mind. We bought him a hot dog, but Dean said we couldn't take him along because we needed room to sleep and room for hitchhikers who could buy a little gas. This was sad, but true. We left him in Dunn at nightfall. I drove through South Carolina and beyond Macon, Georgia, as Dean, Mary Lou, and Ed slept. All alone in the night, I had my own thoughts and held the car to the white line in the holy road. What was I doing? Where am I going? Well, I'd soon find out. I got dog-tired beyond Macon and woke up Dean to resume. We got out of the car for air, and suddenly, both of us were stoned with joy to realize that in the darkness all around us was fragrant green grass and the smell of fresh manure and warm waters. We're in the South. We've left the winter. Faint daybreak illuminated green shoots by the side of the road. I took a deep breath. A locomotive howled across the darkness, Mobile bound. So were we. I took off my shirt and exulted. 10 miles down the road, Dean drove into a filling station with the motor off, noticed that the attendant was fast asleep at the desk, jumped out, quietly filled the gas tank, saw to it the bell didn't ring, and rolled off like an Arab with a $5 tank full of gas for our pilgrimage. I slept and woke up to the crazy, exultant sounds of music and Dean and Mary Lou talking and the great green land rolling by. Where are we? Just past the tip of Florida, man. Flomaton, it's called, Florida. We were rolling down the coastal plain, and Mobile, up ahead, were great soaring clouds of the Gulf of Mexico. It was only 32 hours since we'd said goodbye to everybody in the dirty snows of the north. We stopped at a gas station, and there Dean and Mary Lou played piggyback around the tanks, and Dunkel went inside, stole 3 packs of cigarettes without trying, we were fresh out, rolling into Mobile over the long tidal highway. We all took our winter clothes off and enjoyed the southern temperature. This was when Dean started telling his life story. And when, beyond Mobile, he came upon an obstruction of wrangling cars at a crossroads, and instead of slipping around them, just balled right through the driveway of a gas station and went right on without relaxing his steady Continental 70. We left gapping faces behind us. He went right on with his tale. I tell you, it's true. I started at 9 with a girl called Millie Mayfair in back of Old Rod's garage on Grant Avenue. Same street Carlo lived on in Denver. That's when my father was still working at the smithies a bit. I remember my aunt yelling out the window, "What are you doing down there in back of the garage?" Oh, honey Mary Lou, if I'd only known you then, wow, how sweet you must have been at 9. He tittered maniacally. He stuck his finger in her mouth and licked it. He took her hand and rubbed it all over himself. She just sat there, smiling serenely. Big, long Ed Dunkel sat looking out the window, talking to himself. Yes, sir, I thought I was that ghost that night. He was also wondering what Galatea Dunkel would say to him in New Orleans. Dean went on. One time I rode a freight from New Mexico clear to L.A. I was 11 years old, lost my father at a siding. We were all in a hobo jungle. I was with a man called Big Red. My father was out drunk in a boxcar. It started to roll. Big Red and I missed it. I didn't see my father for months. I rode a long freight all the way to California, really flying, first class freight, a desert zipper. All the way I rode over the couplings. You can imagine how dangerous. I was only a kid, I didn't know, clutching a loaf of bread under one arm and another hooked around the brake bar. This is no story, this is true. When I got to LA, I was so starved for milk and cream, I got a job in a dairy, and the first thing I did, I drank 2 quarts of heavy cream and puked. Poor Dean, said Mary Lou, and she kissed him. He stared proudly ahead. He loved her. We were suddenly driving along the blue waters of the Gulf, And at the same time, a momentous, mad thing began on the radio. It was the Chicken Jazz and Gumbo disc jockey show from New Orleans. All mad jazz records, colored records, with the disc jockey saying, "Oh, don't worry about nothing. We saw New Orleans in the night ahead of us with joy." Dean rubbed his hands over the wheel. "Now we're gonna get out our kicks." At dusk, we were coming into the humming streets of New Orleans. "Oh, smell the people," yelled Dean with his face out the window sniffing. "Ah, God, life!" He swung around a trolley. Yes! He darted the car and looked in every direction for girls. Look at her! The air was so sweet in New Orleans. It seemed to come in soft bandanas, and you could smell the river and really smell the people, the mud and the molasses, and every kind of tropical exhalation with your nose suddenly removed from the dry ices of a northern winter. We bounced in our seats. "And dig her!" yelled Dean, pointing at another woman. "Oh, I love, love, love women. I think women are wonderful. I love women." He spat out the window. He groaned. He clutched his head. Great beads of sweat fell from his forehead from pure excitement and exhaustion. We bounced the car up onto the Algiers ferry and found ourselves crossing the Mississippi River by boat. Now, we must all get out and dig the river and the people and smell the world, said Dean, bustling then with his sunglasses and cigarettes, leaping out of the car like a jack-in-the-box. We followed. On rails we leaned and looked at the great brown father of water, rolling down from mid-America like the torrent of broken souls bearing Montana logs and Dakota muds and Iowa bales and things that had drowned in Three Forks where the secret began in ice. Smoky New Orleans. It receded on one side. Old sleepy Algiers with its warped wood sides bumped us on the other. Negroes were working in the hot afternoon, stoking the ferry furnace that burned red and made our tires smell. Dean dug them, hopping up and down in the heat. He rushed around the deck and upstairs with his baggy pants hanging halfway down his belly. Suddenly, I saw him eagering on the flying bridge. I expected him to take off on wings. I heard his mad laugh all over the boat. Mary Lou was with him. He covered everything in a jiffy, came back with the full story, jumped in the car just as everybody was tooting to go, and we slipped off, passing 2 or 3 cars in a narrow space, and found ourselves darting through Algiers.
So we have one more reader, and then we're going to take this intermission, a 10-minute intermission. Yeah. So, ladies and gentlemen, Kevin Corrigan.
Hello. I didn't know I was next. Scared. Embrace that. Try to work with that. I like this book. I read this book. I read it, 25 years ago. Oh, oh, oh. Oh, man. I'll talk later, right? Great, beautiful clouds floated overhead, valley clouds that made you feel the vastness of old tumble-down holy America from mouth to mouth and tip to tip. All pep and juices was bull. Say, did I ever tell you about Dael's father? He was the funniest old man you ever saw in your life. He had paresis, which eats away at the forepart of your brain. You get so you're not responsible for anything that comes into your mind. He had a house in Texas and I had carpenters working 24 hours a day putting on new wings. He'd leap up in the middle of the night and say, I don't want that goddamn wing, put it over there. The carpenters had to take everything down, start all over again. Come dawn, you'd see them hammering away at the new wing. Then the old man would get bored with that and say, God damn it, I want to go to Maine. And he'd get in his car and he'd drive off 100 miles an hour. Great showers of chicken feathers followed in his track for hundreds of miles. He'd stop his car in the middle of a Texas town, just to get out and buy some whiskey. Traffic would honk all around him. He'd come rushing out of the store yelling, "That's your goddamn noise, you bunch of bastards!" He lisped. When you have paresis, you lisps. One night he came to my house in Cincinnati. He tooted the horn. He said, "Come on, let's go to Texas to see Dael." And he was going back from Maine. He claimed he bought a house. We wrote a story about him in college where you see this horrible shipwreck and people in the water clutching at the sides of the lifeboat. And the old man's in there with a machete, hacking at their fingers. "Get away, you bunch of bastards! From my goddamn boat!" He was horrible. I could tell you stories about him all day. Say, ain't this a nice day? And it sure was. The soft breezes blew in from the levee. It was worth the whole trip. We went into the house after Bull to measure the wall for a shelf. He showed us the dining room table he built. It was made of wood, 6 inches thick. "This is a table that'll last 1,000 years," said Bull, leaning his long, thin face at us maniacally. And he banged on it. In the evenings, he sat at this table, picking at his food and throwing the bones to the cats. He had 7 cats. I love cats. I especially like the ones that squeal when I hold them over the bathtub. He insisted on demonstrating. Someone was in the bathroom. "Well," he said, "we can't do that now." "Say, I've been having a fight with the neighbors next door." He told us about the neighbors. They were a vast crew with sassy children who threw stones over the rickety fence at Dodie and Ray, and sometimes at Old Bull. He told them to cut it out. The old man rushed out and yelled something in Portuguese. Bull went in the house and came back with his shotgun, upon which he leaned demurely, the incredible simper on his face beneath the long hat brim, his whole body writhing coyly and snakily as he waited, a grotesque, lank, lonely clown beneath the clouds. The sight of him, the Portuguese must have thought something out of an old evil dream. Well, we scoured the yard for things to do. There was a tremendous fence Bull had been working on to separate him from the obnoxious neighbors. It would never be finished. The task was too much. He rocked it back and forth to show how solid it was. Suddenly he grew tired and quiet and went in the house, and he disappeared in the bathroom for his pre-lunch fix. He came out glassy-eyed and calm. He sat down under his burning lamp. The sunlight poked feebly behind the drawn shade. Say, why don't you fellows try my organ accumulator? Put some juice in your bones. I always rush up and take off 90 miles an hour for the nearest whorehouse. That was his laugh. That was his laugh when he wasn't really laughing. The organ accumulator is an ordinary box big enough for a man to sit inside on a chair. It's a layer of wood, a layer of metal, and another layer of wood gathering organs from the atmosphere. Hold them captive long enough for the human body to absorb more than a usual share. Now, according to Reich, organs are vibratory atmospheric atoms of the life principle. People get cancer because they run out of organs. Old Bull thought his organ accumulator would be improved if the wood he used was as organic as possible. So he tied bushy bayou leaves and twigs to his mystical outhouse. It stood there in the hot, flat yard, an exfoliate machine clustered and bedecked with maniacal contrivances. Old Bull slipped off his clothes. He went in to sit and moon over his navel. Say, Sal, after lunch, let's you and me go play the horses over to the bookie joint in Gretna. He was magnificent. He took a nap after lunch in his chair, the air gun on his lap, and little Ray curled around his neck, sleeping. It was a pretty sight, father and son. A father who would certainly never bore his son when it came to finding things to do and talk about. He woke up with a start and stared at me. It took him a minute to recognize who I was. What are you going to do what are you going to the coast for, Sal? He asked. And he went back to sleep in a moment. In the afternoon, we went to Gretna, just Bull and me. We drove in his old Chevy. Dean's Hudson was low and sleek. Bull's Chevy was high and rattly. It was just like 1910. The bookie joint was located near the waterfront in a big chromium leather bar that opened up in the back to a tremendous hall where entries and numbers were posted on the wall. Louisiana characters lounged around with racing forms. Bull and I had a beer. Casually, Bull went over to the slot machine and threw a $50 piece in. The counters clicked, jackpot, jackpot, jackpot. And the last jackpot hung for just a moment and slipped back to Cherry. He had lost $100 or more just by a hair. Damn, yelled Bull. They got these things adjusted. You could see it right then. I had the jackpot, and the mechanism clicked it back. Well, what are you gonna do? We examined the racing form. I hadn't played horses in years and was bemused with all the new names. There was one horse called Big Pop that sent me into a temporary trance, thinking of my father, who used to play the horses with me. I was just about to mention it to Old Bull when he said, well, I think I'll try this Ebony Corsair here. And then I finally said it. Big Pop reminds me of my father. He mused just for a second, his clear blue eyes fixed on mine hypnotically so that I couldn't tell what he was thinking or where he was. And then he went over and he bet on Ebony Corsair. Big Pop won. Paid 50 to 1. Damn, said Bull. I should have known better. I've had experience with this before. Oh, when will I ever learn? Like, what do you mean? The Big Pop is what I mean. You had a vision, boy, a vision. Only damn fools pay no attention to visions. How do you know your father who was an old horse player, just didn't momentarily communicate to you that Big Pop was going to win the race? That name brought that feeling up in you. He took advantage of the name to communicate. That's what I was thinking about when you mentioned it. My cousin in Missouri once bet on a horse that had a name that reminded him of his mother, and it won, paid a big price. Same thing happened this afternoon. He shook his head. Let's go. It's the last time I'll ever play the horses with you around. All these visions drive me to distraction. In the car, as we drove back to his old house, he said, mankind will someday realize that we are actually in contact with the dead and with the other world, with whatever it is. Right now, we could predict, if we only exerted through enough mental will, what is going to happen within the next 100 years, and be able to take steps to avoid all kinds of catastrophes. When a man dies, he undergoes a mutation in his brain that we know nothing about, which will be very clear someday if scientists get on the ball. The bastards right now are only interested in see if they could blow up the world. We told Jane about it. She sniffed. It sounds silly to me. She plied the broom around the kitchen. Bull went into the bathroom for his afternoon fix. Out on the road, Dean and Ed Dunkel were playing basketball with Doty's ball and a bucket nailed on a lamppost. I joined in. Then we turned to feats of athletic prowess. Dean completely amazed me. He and Ed and me he had Ed and me hold a bar of iron up to our waists. And just standing there, he popped right over it, holding his heels. And just standing there, go ahead, raise it, he said. We kept raising it till it was chest high. Still, he jumped over it with ease. And then he tried the running broad jump and did at least 20 feet and more. Then I raced down the road. I could do the 110.5. He passed me like the wind. As we ran, I had a mad vision of Dean running through all of life, just like that. His bony face out thrust to life, his arms pumping, his brow sweating, his legs twinkling like Groucho Marx, yelling, "Yes, yes, man, you sure can go." But nobody could go as fast as he could, and that's the truth. And then Bull came out with a couple of knives, and he started showing us how to disarm a would-be shiver in a dark alley. For my part, I showed him a very good trick, which is falling on the ground in front of your adversary and gripping him with your ankles and flipping him over on his hands and grabbing his wrists in a full Nelson. He said it was pretty good. He demonstrated some jiu-jitsu. Little Dodie came over, called her mother to the porch and said, "Look at these silly men." She was such a cute, sassy little thing that Dean couldn't take his eyes off her. Wow, wait till she grows up. You see her cutting down Canal Street with her cute eyes? He hissed through his teeth. We spent a mad day downtown in downtown New Orleans, walking around with the Dunkels. Dean was out of his mind that day. When he saw the T&O freight trains in the yard, he wanted to show me everything at once. "You'll be a brakeman before I'm through with you." He and Ed Dunkel ran across the tracks and hopped a freight at 3 individual points. Mary Lou and Galatea were waiting in the car. We rode the train a half a mile into the piers, waving at switchmen and flagmen. They showed me the proper way to get off a moving car, the back foot first, and let the train go away from you and come around and place the other foot down. They showed me the refrigerator cars, the ice compartments. Good for a ride on any winter night in a string of empties. "Remember what I told you about New Mexico and LA?" cried Dean. "This is the way I hung on." We got back to the girls an hour late, and of course they were mad. Ed and Galatea had decided to get a room in New Orleans and stay there and work. This was okay with Bull, who was getting sick and tired of the whole mob. The invitation originally was for me to come alone. In the front room where Dean and Mary Lou slept, there were jam and coffee stains and empty Benny tubes all over the floor. What's more, it was Bull's workroom, and he couldn't get on with his shelves. Poor Jane was driven to distraction by the continual jumping and running around on the part of Dean. We were waiting for my next GI check to come through. My aunt was forwarding it. And then we were off, the 3 of us, Dean, Mary Lou, me. When the check came, I realized I hated to leave Bull's wonderful house so suddenly. But Dean was all energies, ready to do. In a sad red dusk, we were finally seated in the car, and Jane, Dodie, little boy Ray, Bull, Ed, Galatea stood around in the high grass, smiling. It was goodbye. And at the last moment, Dean and Bull had a misunderstanding over money. Dean had wanted to borrow. Bull said it was out of the question. The feeling reached back to Texas days. Con man Dean was antagonizing people away from him by degrees. He giggled maniacally. He didn't care. He rubbed his fly, stuck his finger in Mary Lou's dress, slurped up her knee, frothed at the mouth, and said, "Darling, you know I know that everything is straight between us. At last, beyond the furthest abstract definition in metaphysical terms, or any terms you want to specify or sweetly impose or hearken back, and so on and so on." And zoom went the car, and off we were off again for California.
Amazing artists. And you know, I didn't say this, but by the way, this event is produced by the Village Trip.
Yes.
With Elizabeth Thompson is the artistic director, along with Cliff Pearson. And it's also produced. The way I got involved was an organization called HB Studio, where I teach acting, and the artistic director of HB Studio is Edith Meeks, and she's here as well. So like I said, we're a little behind, so I'm just going to tell you we're going to start sharp at 4:44. So 10-minute intermission. Thanks so much. The bathroom, by the way, there's a bathroom. If you go in there, make a left. It's on the right. If you need the bathroom, in there, left on the right.
Hey. Hey, bravo.
But you can still reach it right here. You want help? You want me to take you over? Want me to take you over?
Are you nice to meet you. Thank you so much for being here. David Amram, paging David Amram, the great, the legend.
talk to him, he's like, I'm fine.
Excuse me, sir, no filming here. Excuse me, sir, no filming allowed here.
Says the guy with like 30 cameras.
I got this amazing thing going now with a split tube that's the band and the speaker. You would appreciate something. It looks like a command. It looks like a little bit like I'm flying to space, but on a I built it myself. Best I could do it. Short notice. Yeah, so far so good.
Right now we'd be
But he's not speaking.
Why is he's here, right? He's here. Is John here? He's right. Okay. So all right. So we're gonna start it up now. But before we do, I just wanted to have all of the amazing musicians introduced. So of course there's David Amram.
Thank you all for coming, and just to introduce the musicians, in case they're not on the program, even if they are, they're just so terrific. And they've never done this before either. We're just listening to these great actors and trying not to get in the way. And that's the whole idea. Collaboration means what Duke Ellington said when he was asked, what advice do you have to give to musicians? And he said, listen. That was all he said. And that's all you've got to do. So if any of you are poets, if you see a cellist in the dry cleaning store that can play up a storm and never got a gig, invite them to come. You know, if you're doing a reading or if you're a writer and you want to get a musician, get someone and just tell them, listen. Play simply. When in doubt, leave it out, and less is more. It's just an attitude. If you do that, anybody can play with anybody. But you have to want to do that. And it's not that hard. You save your hot licks for other occasions. The musicians who can, as you heard coming in, can sure play some hot licks, but they don't do that when these great artists are reading beautiful literature. Playing the drums, Mr. Kevin Twigg. I'm playing the conga drums, a fine young man. I've known him for years and always enjoyed being with him, and my own son, Mr. Adam Amram. And playing the bass violin, I'll move over so in the theater you're told not to upstage other people. You notice the younger folks here that he doesn't have frets on his instrument, so he has to put his finger down at the right place at the right time. Overqualified for 2022. So are all these great actors, but that doesn't mean you can't be terrific. Mr. Rene Hart.
Yeah! Thank you so much, David, and thank you all of you so much for being here today. So again, 4 more readers, and I'm so happy to start with the amazing, the incredible Dael Orlandersmith.
you hear me? Huh? No, you can't. Yes, now, yeah? Yeah. Okay.
That's nice.
Yes?
That's nice.
Now, we had a number of circumstances to deal with in Denver, and they were of an entirely different order from those of 1947. We could either get another travel bureau car at once, or stay a few days for kicks and look for his father. We were both exhausted and dirty. In the John of a restaurant, I was at a urinal blocking Dean's way to the sink. I stepped out before I was finished and resumed at another urinal and said to Dean, "Yo, dig this." "Yes, man," he said, washing his hands at the sink. "It's a very good trick, but awful on your kidneys, because when you're getting a little older now, every time you do this, eventually years of misery in your old age, awful kidney misery is for the days when you sit in parks." Made me mad. Who's old? I'm not much older than you are. I wasn't saying that, man. I said, you're always making cracks about my age. I'm no old fag like that fag. You don't have to warn me about my kidneys. We went back to the booth, and just as the waitress set down the hot roast beef sandwiches, and ordinarily Dean would have leaped to wolf the food at once, I said to cap my anger, "Ann, I don't want to hear any more of it." And suddenly, Dean's eyes grew tearful, and he got up, left his food steaming there, and walked out of the restaurant. I wondered if he was just wandering off forever. I didn't care. I was so mad. I flipped momentarily and turned it on Dean. But at the sight of his uneaten food made me sadder than anything in years. I shouldn't have said that. He likes to eat so much. He's never let his food like this. What the hell? That's showing him anyway. Dean stood outside the restaurant for exactly 5 minutes, then came back, sat down. "Well," I said, "what were you doing out there, knotting up your fists? Cursing me, thinking up new gags about my kidneys?" Dean mutely shook his head. "No, man, no, you're completely wrong. If you want to know, well, go ahead, tell me." I said all this and never once looked up from my food. I felt like a beast. I was crying. "Oh, hell, you never cry." "You say that? What do you think I don't cry? You don't die enough to cry." Every one of these things I said was a knife at myself. Everything I'd never secretly held against my brother was coming out. How ugly I was and what filth I was, discovering in the depths of my own impure psychologies. Dean was shaking his head. "No, man." I was crying. "Go on. I bet you were so mad you had to leave." "No, believe me, Sal. Really, do believe me if you ever believed anything about me." I knew he was telling the truth, yet I didn't want to bother with the truth. And when I looked up at him, I think I was cockeyed from cracked intestinal twistings in my awful belly. Then I knew I was wrong. "Oh man, Dean, I'm sorry. I never acted this way before with you." Well, you know me. You know I don't have close relationships with anybody anymore. I don't know what to do with these things. I hold things in my hand like pieces of crap and don't know where to put it. Let's forget it. The holy con man began to eat. "It's not my fault. It's not my fault," I told him. "Nothing in this lousy world is my fault. Don't you see that? I don't want it to be and can't let it be and won't be." "Yeah, man, yeah, but please hearken back and believe me. I do believe you, I do." This was the sad story of that afternoon. All kinds of tremendous complications arose that night when Dean and I went to stay with this Okie family. These had been neighbors of mine in my Denver solitude of 2 weeks before. Mother was a wonderful woman in jeans who drove coal trucks in winter mountains to support her kids, 4 in all. Husband having left her years before when they were traveling around the country in a trailer. They had rolled all the way from Indiana to LA in that trailer after many a good time and a big Sunday afternoon drunk in crossroads and bars and laughter and guitar playing at night. The big lout had suddenly walked off across the dark field and never returned. Her children were wonderful. Eldest was a boy who wasn't around that summer but in a camp in the mountains. Next was a lovely 13-year-old daughter who wrote poetry and picked flowers in the fields and wanted to grow up to be an actress in Hollywood. Janet by name. Then came the little ones. Little Jimmy, who sat around the campfire at night and cried for his pea tater before it was roasted. and little Lucy, who made pets of worms, horny toads, beetles, and anything that crawled, and gave them names and places to live. They had 4 dogs. They lived their ragged and joyous lives on the new little settlement street where they were the butt of the neighbor's semi-respectable sense of propriety only because the poor woman's husband had left her and because they littered up the yard. At night, all the lights of Denver lay like great wheels on the plain below. For the house that was in part western where the mountains fell rolling down to the hills to the plain and where in primeval times soft waves must have washed from sea like Mississippi to make such round, perfect stools for the island peaks like Evans and Pikes and Long. Dean went there, and of course he was all sweats and joys at the sight of him, especially Janet. But I warned him not to touch her. Probably didn't have to. The woman was a great man's woman and took to Dean right away, but she was bashful, and he was bashful. She said Dean reminded her of the husband gone, just like him. Oh, crazy one, I tell you. The results was uproarious. Beer drinking in the littered living room, shouting suppers, booming Long Ranger radio. The complications rose like clouds of butterflies. The woman Frankie, everyone called her, was finally about to buy a jalopy as she'd been threatening to do for years and had recently come into a few bucks toward one. Dean immediately took over the responsibility of selecting and naming the price of the car because, of course, he wanted to use it himself. So as of yore, he could pick up girls coming out of high school in the afternoons and drive them to the mountains. Poor, innocent Frankie was always agreeable to anything, but she was afraid to part with her money when they got to the car lot and stood before the salesman. Dean sat down in the dust of the Alameda Boulevard and beat his fist on his head. For 100, you can't get any better. He swore he'd never talk to her again. He cursed till his face was purple. He was about to jump in the car and drive it away anyway. Oh, these dumb Okies, they'll never change. How completely and unbelievably dumb the movement when it comes to act. This paralysis, scared, hysterical, nothing frightens them more than what they want. It's my father, my father, my father, all over again. Dean was very excited that night because his cousin Sam Brady was meeting us at a bar. He was wearing a clean t-shirt and beaming all over. Now listen, Sal, I must tell you about Sam. He's my cousin. By the way, have you looked for your father? Well, this afternoon, man, went down to Jig's Buffet where he used to pour draft beer and tender befuddlement and get hell from the boss and go staggering out. No, went to the old barber shop next to the window. No, not there. Old fella told me he was, imagine, working in a railroad gandy, dancing cook shack or something for the Boston and Maine in New England. But I don't believe him. They made up fraction stories for a dime. Now listen to here. In my childhood, Sam Brody, my close cousin, was my absolute hero. He used to bootleg whiskey from the mountains and one time had a tremendous fist fight with his brother that lasted 2 hours in the yard and had the women screaming and terrified. We used to sleep together. This one man in the family who took tender concern for me, and tonight I'm gonna see him again for the first time in 7 years. Just got back from Missouri. And what's the pitch? No pitch, man. I only want to know what's been happening in the family. I have a family, remember, and most importantly, Sal, I want him to tell me things that I've forgotten in my childhood. I want to remember. I do. I never saw Dean so glad and excited. While we waited for his cousin in the bar, he talked a lot to younger hipsters and hustlers and checked out new gangs and goings-on. Then he made inquiries about Mary Lou since she'd been in Denver recently. Sal, in my young days when I used to come to this corner to steal change off the newsstand for Bowery brew stew, that rough-looking cat you see out there, Stan had nothing but murder in his heart. Got in one horrible fight right after another. I remember his scars even. Till now years, YEARS of standing on the corner have finally softened him and chasing him ragely here completely. He's become sweet and willing and patient with everybody. He's become a fixture on the corner. You see how things can happen? Then Sam arrived, wiry, curly-haired man of 35 with work-gnarled hands. Dean stood in awe before him. "No," said Stan Brady. "I don't drink anymore." You see, whispered Dean in my ear. "He doesn't drink anymore, and he used to be the biggest whiskey keg in town. He's got religion now. He told me over the phone, dig the change in a man. My hero has become so strange." Sam Brady was suspicious of his young cousin. He took us out for a spin in his old rattly coupe, and immediately he made his position in the car clear in regard to Dean. "Now look, Dean, I don't believe you anymore or anything you're going to try to tell me. I came to see you tonight because there's a paper I want you to sign for the family. Your father is no longer mentioned among us, and we want absolutely nothing to do with him, and sorry to say, with you either anymore." I looked at Dean. His face dropped and darkened. "Oh, yes, he said. The cousin continued to drive us around and even brought us ice cream pops. Nevertheless, Dean plied him with innumerable questions about the past, and the cousin complied with the questions, and for a moment, Dean almost began to sweat again with excitement. Where was his raggedy father that night?" The cousin dropped us off at the sad lights of a carnival on Alameda Boulevard at Federal. He made an appointment with Dean for the paper signing next afternoon and left. I told Dean I was sorry he had nobody in the world to believe in him. "Remember that. I believe in you. I'm infinitely sorry for the foolish grievance I held against you yesterday afternoon." "All right, man, it's agreed," said Dean. We dug the carnival together. There were merry-go-rounds, Ferris wheels, popcorn, roulette wheels, sawdust, and hundreds of young Denver kids in jeans wandering around. Dust rose to the stars together with every sad music on earth. Dean was wearing washed-out tight Levi's and a t-shirt and looked suddenly like a real Denver character again. There were motorcycle kids and visors and mustaches and beaded jackets hanging around the shrouds in the back of the tents with pretty girls in Levi's and rose shorts. There were a lot of Mexican girls too, and one amazing little girl about 3 feet high, a midget with the most beautiful and tender face in the world, who turned to her companion and said, "Man, let's call up Gomez and cut out." Dean stopped dead in his tracks at the sight of her. A great knife stabbed him from the darkness of the night. "Man, I love her. Oh, love her." We had to follow her around for a long time. She finally went across the highway to make a phone call in a motel booth, and Dean pretended to be looking through the pages of the directory, but was really all wound tight, watching her. I tried to open up a conversation with the Lovey Doll's friends, but they paid no attention to us. Gomez arrived in a ratty truck and took the girls off. Dean stood in the road, clutching his breast. "Oh, man, I almost died. Why the hell didn't you talk to her?" I couldn't. We decided to buy some beer and go to Okie Frankie's and play records. We hitched on the road with a bag of beer cans. Little Janet, Frankie's 13-year-old daughter, was the prettiest girl in the world and was about to grow up into a gone woman. Best of all were her long, tapering, sensitive fingers that she used to talk with, like Cleopatra Nile dance. Dean sat in the farthest corner of the room, watching her with slitted eyes and saying, "Yes, yes, yes." Janet was already aware of him. She turned to me for protection. Previous months of that summer, I'd spent a lot of time with her, talking about books and little things she was interested in. Thanks.
Well, Jack Kerouac was a hero of mine back from my college days, so when David called and said, "Would you be interested in doing a reading of On the Road?" I thought, wow. At the Strand Book Store, I said, wow. The iconic Strand Book Store. And David Amram is going to do the music under the reading. I thought, oh my God, I got to do this. There's no way I'm not doing this. And so here we are. It was May. And how could homely afternoons in Colorado, with its farms and irrigation ditches and shady dells, the places where little boys go swimming, produce a bug like the bug that bit Stan Shepard? He had his arm draped over the broken door and was riding along and talking happily, when suddenly a bug flew into his arm and embedded a long stinger in it that made him howl. It had come out of an American afternoon. He yanked and slapped at his arm and dug out the stinger. In a few minutes, his arm had begun to swell and hurt. Dean and I couldn't figure what it was. The thing was to wait and see if the swelling went down. Here we were, heading for unknown southern lands, and barely 3 miles out of hometown, poor old hometown of childhood, a strange, feverish, exotic bug rose from secret corruptions and sent fear into our hearts. What is it? I've never known of a bug around here that can make a swelling like that. Damn! It made the trip seem sinister and doomed. We drove on. Stan's arm got worse. We'd stop at the first hospital and have him get a shot of penicillin. We passed Castle Rock, came to Colorado Springs at dark. The great shadow of Pikes Peak loomed to our right. We bowled down the Pueblo Highway. I've hitched thousands and thousands of times on this road, said Dean. I hid behind that exact wire fence there one night when I suddenly took fright for no reason whatever. We all decided to tell our stories, but one by one, and Stan was first. We got a long way to go, preambled Dean, and so you must take every indulgence and deal with every single detail you can bring to mind. And still it won't be all told. Easy, easy, he cautioned Stan, who began telling the story. You've got to relax, too. Stan swung into his life story as we shot across the dark. He started with his experiences in France, but to round out ever-growing difficulties, he came back and started at the beginning with his boyhood in Denver. He and Dean compared times they'd seen each other zooming around on bicycles. One time you've forgotten, I know, Arapahoe Garage, recall? I bounced a ball at you on the corner and you knocked it back to me with your fist and it went in the sewer. Grammar days. Now recall? Stan was nervous and feverish. He wanted to tell Dean everything. Dean was now arbiter, old man, judge, listener, approver, nodder. Yes, yes, go on, please. We passed Walsenburg. Suddenly we passed Trinidad, where Chad King was somewhere off the road in front of a campfire with perhaps a handful of anthropologists, and as of yore, he too was telling his life story. And never dreamed we were passing at that exact moment on the highway, headed for Mexico, telling our own stories. Oh, sad American night. Then we were in New Mexico and passed the rounded rocks of Raton and stopped at a diner, ravingly hungry for hamburgers, some of which we wrapped in a napkin to eat over the border below. The whole vertical state of Texas lies before us, Sal, said Dean. Before we made it horizontal, every bit as long. We'll be in Texas in a few minutes and won't be out till tomorrow this time and won't stop driving. Think of it. We drove on. Across the immense plain of night lay the first Texas town, Dalhart, which I crossed in 1947. It lay glimmering on the dark floor of the earth 50 miles away. The land by moonlight was all mesquite and waste. On the horizon was the moon. She fattened. She grew huge and rusty. She mellowed and rolled till the morning star contended and dews began to blow in our windows. And still we rolled. After Dalhart, empty cracker box town, we bowled for Amarillo and reached it in the morning among windy panhandle grasses that only a few years ago waved around a collection of buffalo tents. Now there were gas stations and new 1950 jukeboxes, and immense ornate snouts and 10-cent slots and awful songs. All the way from Amarillo to Childress, Dean and I pounded plot after plot of books we'd read into Stan, who asked for it because he wanted to know. At Childress, in the hot sun, we turned directly south on a lesser road and highballed across abysmal waste to Paducah, Guthrie, and Abilene, Texas. Now Dean had to sleep, and Stan and I sat in the front seat and drove. The old car burned and bopped and struggled on. Great clouds of gritty wind blew at us from shimmering spaces. Stan rolled right along with stories about Monte Carlo and Cagnes-sur-Mer and the blue places near Menton where dark-faced people wandered among white walls. Texas is undeniable. We burned slowly into Abilene and all woke up to look at it. Imagine living in this town 1,000 miles from cities. Whoop, whoop, over there by the tracks, Old Town Abilene, where they shipped the cows and shot it up for gumshoes and drank red-eye. Look out there, yelled Dean, out the window with his mouth contorted like W.C. Fields. He didn't care about Texas or any place. Red-faced Texans paid him no mind and hurried along the burning sidewalks. We stopped to eat on the highway south of town. Nightfall seemed like 1,000,000 miles away as we resumed for Coleman and Brady, the heart of Texas. Only wildernesses of brush with an occasional house near a thirsty creek and a 50-mile dirt road detour and endless heat. Old Dobie, Mexico's a long way away, said Dean, sleepily from the back seat. So keep her rolling, boys, and we'll be kissing senoritas by dawn, because this old Ford can roll if you know how to talk to her and ease her along. Except the back end's about to fall, but don't worry about it till we get there. And he went to sleep. I took the wheel and drove to Fredericksburg. And here again I was crisscrossing the old map again. Same place Mary Lou and I held hands on a snowy morning in 1949. And where was Mary Lou now? Blow, yelled Dean in a dream, and I guess he was dreaming of Frisco jazz and maybe Mexican mambo to come. Stan talked and talked. Dean had wound him up the night before, and now he was never going to stop. He was in England by now, relating adventures hitchhiking on the English road, London to Liverpool, with his hair long and his pants ragged, and strange British truck drivers giving him lifts in glooms of the Europe void. We were all red-eyed from the continual mistral winds of old Texas. There was a rock in each of our bellies, and we knew we were getting there, if slowly. The car pushed 40 with shuddering effort. From Fredericksburg, we descended the Great Western High Plains. Moss began smashing our windshield. Getting down into the hot country now, boys. The desert rats and the tequila. And this is my first time this far south in Texas, added Dean with wonder. God damn, this is where my old man comes in the wintertime. Sly old bum. Suddenly, we were in absolutely tropical heat at the bottom of a 5-mile long hill. And up ahead we saw the lights of old San Antonio. You had the feeling all this used to be Mexican territory indeed. Houses by the side of the road were different. Gas stations beater. Fewer lamps. Dean delightedly took the wheel to roll us into San Antonio. We entered town in a wilderness of Mexican rickety southern shacks without cellars and with old rocking chairs on the porch. We stopped at a mad gas station to get a grease job. Mexicans were standing around in the hot light of the overhead bulbs that were blackened by valley summer bugs, reaching down into a soft drink box and pulling out beer bottles and throwing the money to the attendant. Whole families lingered around doing this. All around there were shacks and drooping trees and a wild cinnamon smell in the air. Frantic teenage Mexican girls came by with boys. "Hoo!" yelled Dean. "Si mañana!" Music was coming from all sides, and all kinds of music. Stan and I drank several bottles of beer and got high. We were already almost out of America, and yet definitely in it, and in the middle of it, where it's maddest. Hot rods blew by. San Antonio, aha! Now, men, listen to me. We might as well goof a couple of hours in San Antonio, and so we will go and find a hospital clinic for Stan's arm, and you and I, Sal, will cut around and get these streets dug. Look at those houses across the street. You can see right into the front room, and all the pretty daughters laying around with True Love magazines. Whee! Come on, let's go. We drove around aimlessly for a while and asked people for the nearest hospital clinic. It was near downtown where things looked more sleek and American. Several semi-skyscrapers and many neons and chain drugstores, yet with cars crashing through from the dark around town as if there were no traffic laws. We parked the car in the hospital driveway, and I went in with Stan to see an intern while Dean stayed in the car and changed. The hall of the hospital was full of poor Mexican women, some of them pregnant, some of them sick or bringing their little sick kiddies. It was sad. I thought of poor Terry and wondered what she was doing now. Stan had to wait an entire hour until an intern came along and looked at his swollen arm. There was a name for the infection he had, but none of us bothered to pronounce it. They gave him a shot of penicillin. Meanwhile, Dean and I went out to dig the streets of Mexican San Antonio. It was fragrant and soft, the softest air I'd ever known, and dark and mysterious and buzzing. Sudden figures of girls in white bandanas appeared in the humming dark. Dean crept along and said not a word. "Oh, this is too wonderful to do anything," he whispered. "Let's just creep along and see everything. Look, a crazy San Antonio pool shack." We went in. A dozen boys were shooting pool at 3 tables, all Mexicans. Dean and I bought Cokes and shoved nickels in the jukebox and played Winoni Blues Harris and Lionel Hampton and Lucky Millinder and jumped. Meanwhile, Dean warned me to watch. Dig now out of the corner of your eye. And as we listened to Winoni blow about his baby's pudding, and as we also smelled the soft air, as you say, dig the kid, the crippled kid shooting pool at table 1. The butt of the joint's jokes. You see, he's been the butt all his life. The other fellows are merciless, but they love him. The crippled kid was some kind of malformed midget with a great big beautiful face, much too large, in which an enormous brown eyes moistly gleamed. Don't you see, Sal? A San Antonio Mex Tom Snark. The same story the world over. See, they hit him on the ass with a cue. Ha, ha, ha. Hear them laugh? You see, he wants to win the game. He's bet 4 bits. Watch. We watched as the angelic young midget aimed for a bank shot. He missed. The other fellows roared. "Oh, man," said Dean. "And now watch." They had the little boy by the scruff of the neck and were mauling him around, playful. He squealed. He stalked out into the night, but not without a backward, bashful, sweet glance. Oh, man, I'd love to know that gone little cat and what he thinks and what kind of girls he has. Oh, man, I'm high on this air. We wandered out, negotiated several dark, mysterious blocks. Innumerable houses hid behind verdant, almost jungle-like yards. We saw glimpses of girls in front rooms, girls on porches, girls in the bushes with boys. I never knew this mad San Antonio. Think what Mexico will be like. Let's go. We rushed back to the hospital. Stan was ready and said he felt much better. We put our arms around him and told him everything we'd done. And now we were ready for the last 150 miles to the magic border. We leaped into the car and off. I was so exhausted by now, I slept all the way through Dilley and Encinal to Laredo and didn't wake up till they were parking the car in front of a lunchroom at 2 o'clock in the morning. Ah, sighed Dean, the end of Texas, the end of America, and we don't know more. It was tremendously hot. We were all sweating buckets. There was no night dew, not a breath of air, nothing except billions of moths smashing at bulbs everywhere, and the low, rank smell of a hot river in the night nearby. The Rio Grande that begins in cool Rocky Mountain dales and ends up fashioning world valleys to mingle its heats with the Mississippi muds in the Great Gulf. Laredo was a sinister town that morning. All kinds of cab drivers and border rats wandered around looking for opportunities. There weren't many. It was too late. It was the bottom and dregs of America where all the heavy villains sink, where disoriented people have to go to be near a specific elsewhere they can slip into unnoticed. Contraband brooded in the heavy syrup air. Cops were red-faced and sullen and sweaty, no swagger. Waitresses were dirty and disgusted. Just beyond, you could feel the enormous presence of whole great Mexico and almost smell the billion tortillas frying and smoking in the night. We had no idea what Mexico would really be like. We were at sea level again, and when we tried to eat a snack, we could hardly swallow it. I wrapped it up in napkins for the trip anyway. We felt awful and sad, but everything changed when we crossed the mysterious bridge over the river and our wheels rolled on official Mexican soil, though it wasn't anything but a carway for border inspection. Just across the street, Mexico began. We looked with wonder. To our amazement, it looked exactly like Mexico. It was 3 in the morning, and fellows in straw hats and white pants were lounging by the dozen against battered Pocky storefronts. "Look at those cats," whispered Dean. "Oh," he breathed softly. "Wait, wait." The Mexican officials came out grinning and asked please if we would take out our baggage. We did. We couldn't take our eyes from across the street. We were longing to rush right up there and get lost in those mysterious Spanish streets. It was only Nuevo Laredo, but it looked like Holy Lhasa to us. "Man, those guys are up all night," whispered Dean. We hurried to get our papers straightened. We were warned not to drink tap water now we were over the border. The Mexicans looked at our baggage in a desultory way. They weren't like officials at all. They were lazy and tender. Dean couldn't stop staring at them. He turned to me. "See how the cops are in this country? I can't believe it." He rubbed his eyes. "I'm dreaming." Then it was time to change our money. We saw great stacks of pesos on a table and learned that 8 of them made an American buck or thereabouts. We changed most of our money and stuffed the big rolls in our pockets with delight.
Ventimiglia.
Hi. So just a brief introduction about my introduction to Jack. When I was in 10th grade, 5th grade, sorry, I was 10 years old, in parochial grammar school, I checked out a book. It was called like
Life, the decade of life. It was Life magazine compilation. And in it, I saw this man, caught my eye instantly. And I read a couple of excerpts and just felt totally connected to him. And then I heard his voice for the first time in a car when I was stoned with my friends. And I said, that's got to be Jack Kerouac. And it was. And it's been a love affair ever since. I appreciate David for his years of friendship and collaboration, and happy to be here today. All right, let's start the car and blow some air, I cried. I'm dying of heat. Right, okay, so we roared out of town and continued along the mad highway with our hair flying. Dawn came rapidly in a gray haze, revealing dense swamps sunk on both sides, with tall, forlorn, viney trees leaning and bowing over tangled bottoms. We bowled right along the railroad tracks for a while. The strange radio station antenna of Ciudad Monte appeared ahead, as if we were in Nebraska. We found a gas station and loaded the tank, just as the last of the jungle night bugs hurled themselves in a black mass against the bulbs and fell fluttering at our feet in a black mass against, in a huge wriggly groups, some of them with wings a good 4 inches long, others frightful dragonflies big enough to eat a bird, and thousands of immense yangling mosquitoes and unnameable spidery insects of all sorts. I hopped up and down on the pavement for fear of them. I finally ended up in the car with my feet in my hands, looking fearfully at the ground where they swarmed around our wheels. Let's go, I yelled. And Dean and Stan weren't perturbed at all by the bugs. They calmly drank a couple of bottles of Mission Orange and kicked them away from the water cooler. Their shirts and pants, like mine, were soaked in the blood and black of thousands of dead bugs. We smelled our clothes deeply. I'm beginning to like the smell, said Stan. I can't smell myself anymore. It's a strange good smell, said Dean. I'm not going to change my shirt till Mexico City. I want to take it all in and remember it. So off we rode again, creating air for our hot, caked faces. Then the mountains loomed ahead, all green. After this climb, we would be in the Great Central Plateau again and ready to roll ahead to Mexico City. In no time at all, we soared to an elevation of 5,000 feet among misty passes that overlooked steaming yellow rivers a mile below. It was the great river Moctezuma. The Indians along the road began to be extremely weird. They were a nation in themselves, mountain Indians, shut off from everything else but the Pan American Highway. They were short and squat and dark, with bad teeth. They carried immense loads on their backs. Across enormous vegetated ravines, we saw patchworks of agriculture on steep slopes. They walked up and down those slopes and worked the crops. Dean drove the car 5 miles an hour to see them. Ooh, I never thought this existed. And high on the highest peak, as great as any Rocky Mountain peak, we saw bananas growing. Dean got out of the car to point, to stand around rubbing his belly. We were on a ledge where a little thatched hut suspended itself over the precipices of the world. The sun created golden hazes that obscured the Montezuma, now more than a mile below. In the yard in front of the hut, a little 3-year-old Indian girl stood with a finger in her mouth, watching us with big brown eyes. She's probably never seen anybody parked here before in her entire life, said Dean. Hello, little girl. How are you? Do you like us? The little girl looked away bashfully and pouted. We began to talk, and she again examined us with finger in her mouth. Gee, I wish there was something we could give her, Think of it, being born and living on this ledge representing all you know of life. Her father's probably groping down the ravine with a rope and getting his pineapples out of a cave and hacking wood at an 80-degree angle with all the bottom below. She'll never leave here and know anything about the outside world. It's a nation. Think of the wild chief they must have. They probably, off the road, over that bluff, miles back, must be even wilder and stranger, yeah. because the Pan American Highway partially civilizes this nation on the road. Notice the beads of sweat on her brow. Dean pointed out with a grimace of pain. It's not the kind of sweat we have. It's oily and it's always there because it's always hot the year round, and she knows nothing of non-sweat. She was born with sweat and dies with sweat. The sweat in her little brow was heavy, sluggish. It didn't run. It just stood there and gleamed like a fine olive oil. What that must do to their souls, how different they must be in their private concerns and evaluations and wishes. Dean drove on with his mouth hanging open in awe, 10 miles an hour, desirous to see every possible human being on the road. We climbed and we climbed. And as we climbed, the air grew cooler, and the Indian girls on the road wore shawls over their heads and shoulders. They held us desperately. We stopped to see. They wanted to sell us little pieces of rock crystal. Their great brown, innocent eyes looked into ours with such soulful intensity that not one of us had the slightest sexual thought about them. Moreover, they were very young, some of them 11, and looked almost 30. Look at those eyes, breathed Dean. They were like the eyes of the Virgin Mother when she was a child. We saw in them the tender and forgiving gaze of Jesus, and they stared unflinchingly into ours. We rubbed our nervous blue eyes and looked again. Still, they penetrated us with sorrowful and hypnotic gleam. When they talked, they suddenly became frantic and almost silly. In their silence, they were themselves. They've only recently learned to sell these crystals since the highway was built about 10 years back. Up until that time, this entire nation must have been silent. The girls yammered around the car. One particularly soulful girl gripped Dean's sweaty arm. She yammered in Indian. Ah, yes, dear one, said Dean tenderly, almost sadly. He got out of the car and went fishing around in the battered trunk in the back, the same old tortured American trunk, and pulled out a wristwatch. He showed it to the child. She whimpered with glee. The others crowded around with amazement. Then Dean poked in the little girl's hand for the sweetest and purest and smallest little crystal she had personally picked for the mountain for me. And he found no one bigger than a berry, and he handed her the wristwatch dangling. Their mouths rounded like the mouths of chorister children. The lucky little girl squeezed it to her ragged breastrobes. They stroked Dean and thanked him. He stood among them with his ragged face to the sky, looking for the next and highest and final pass, and seemed like the prophet that had come to them. He got back in the car. They hated to see us go. For the longest time, as we mounted a straight pass, they waved and ran after us. We made a turn and never saw them again. And they were still running after us. "Oh, this breaks my heart," cried Dean, punching his chest. "How far do they carry out these loyalties and wonders? What's gonna happen to them? Would they try to follow the car all the way to Mexico City if we drove slow enough?" "Yes," I said, for I knew. We came into the dizzying heights of the Sierra Madre Oriental. The banana trees gleamed golden in the haze. Great fogs yawned beyond stone walls along the precipice. Below, the Moctezuma was a thin golden thread in a green jungle mat. Strange crossroad towns on top of the world rode by, with shawled Indians watching us from under hat brims and barbosos. Life was dense, dark, ancient. They watched Dean, serious and insane at his raving wheel, with eyes of hawks. All had their hands outstretched. They had come down from the back mountains and higher places to hold forth their hands for something they thought civilization could offer. And they never dreamed the sadness and the poor broken delusion of it. They didn't know that a bomb had come that could crack all our bridges and roads and reduce them to jumbles. And we would be as poor as they someday, and stretching out our hands in the same way. Our broken Ford, old 30s upgoing American Ford, rattled through them and vanished in dust. We had reached the approaches of the last plateau. Now the sun was golden, the air keen blue, and the desert, with its occasional rivers, a riot of sandy, hot space, and sudden biblical tree shade. Now Dean was sleeping and stand driving. The shepherds appeared, dressed as in first times, in long flowing robes. The women carrying golden bundles of flax, the men staves. Under great trees on the shimmering desert, the shepherds sat and convened, and the sheep moiled in the sun and raised dust beyond. Man, man, I yelled to Dean. Wake up and see the shepherds. Wake up and see the golden world that Jesus came from. With your own eyes, you can tell. He shot his head up from the seat, saw one glimpse of it all in the fading red sun, and dropped back to sleep. When he woke up, he described it to me in detail, and he said, "Yes, man, I'm glad you told me to look. Oh, Lord, what shall I do? Where will I go?" He rubbed his belly. He looked to heaven with red eyes. He almost wept. The end of our journey impended. Great fields stretched on both sides of us. A noble wind blew across the occasional immense tree groves and over old missions turning salmon pink in the late sun. The clouds were close and huge and rose. Mexico City by dusk, we'd made it. A total of 1,900 miles from the afternoon yards of Denver to these vast and biblical areas of the world. And now we're about to reach the end of the road. Shall we change our insect t-shirts? Nah. Let's wear them to town. Hell, man. And we drove into Mexico City. A brief mountain pass took us suddenly to a height from which we saw all of Mexico City stretched out in its volcanic crater below and spewing city smokes and early dusk lights. Down to it we zoomed, down Insurgentes Boulevard, straight toward the heart of the town of Reforma. Kids playing soccer in enormous, sad fields and threw up dust. Taxi drivers overtook us and wanted to know if we wanted girls. Nah, we don't want girls now. Long, ragged adobe slums stretched out on the plain. We saw lonely figures in the dimming alleys. Soon night would come. Then the city roared in, and suddenly we were passing crowded cafes and theaters and many lights. Newsboys yelled at us. Mechanics slouched by barefoot with wrenches and rags. Mad barefoot Indian drivers cut across us and surrounded us and tooted and made frantic traffic. The noise was incredible. No mufflers are used on Mexican cars. Horns are battered with glee, continual. Whee, yelled Dean. Wow, look out. He staggered the car through the traffic and played with everybody. He drove like an Indian. He got on a circular Glorieta Drive on Reforma Boulevard and rolled around it with its 8 spokes shooting cars at us from all directions, left, right, izquierda, dead ahead, and yelled and jumped for joy. This is traffic I've always dreamed of. Everybody goes. An ambulance came bawling through. American ambulances darted and weaved through traffic with siren blowing. The great worldwide Felhin Indian ambulances merely come through at 80 miles an hour in the city streets, and everybody just has to get out of the way. And they don't pause for anybody or any circumstances and fly straight through. We saw it reeling out of sight on skittering wheels in the breaking up moil of dense downtown traffic. The drivers were Indians. People, even old ladies, ran for buses that never stopped. Young Mexico City businessmen made bets and ran by squads for buses and athletically jumped them. The bus drivers were barefoot, sneering and insane, and saw low and squat in t-shirts at the low, enormous wheels. Icons burned over them. The lights in the buses were brown and greenish, and dark faces were lined on wooden benches. In downtown Mexico City, thousands of hipsters in floppy straw hats and long lapelled jackets over bare chests padded along the main drag, some of them selling crucifixes and weed in the alleys. Some of them kneeling in beach chapels next to Mexican burlesque shows in sheds. Some alleys were rubble with open sewers and little doors led to closet-sized bars stuck in adobe walls. You had to jump over a ditch to get your drink, and in the bottom of the ditch was the ancient lake of the Aztec. You came out of the bar with your back to the wall and edged back to the street. They served coffee mixed with rum and nutmeg. Mambo blared from everywhere. Hundreds of whores lined themselves along the dark and narrow streets, and their sorrowful eyes gleamed at us in the night. We wandered in a frenzy and a dream. We ate beautiful steaks for 48 cents in a strange tiled Mexican cafeterias with generations of marimba musicians standing at one immense marimba. Also wandering singing guitarists and old men on corners blowing trumpets. You went by the sour stink of pulque saloons. They gave you a water glass of cactus juice in there, 2 cents. Nothing stopped. The streets were alive all night. Beggars slept wrapped in advertising posters torn off of fences. Whole families of them sat on the sidewalk, playing little flutes and chuckling in the night. Their bare feet stuck out, their dim candles burned. All Mexico was one vast bohemian swamp. On corners, old women cut up the boiled heads of cows and wrapped morsels in tortillas and served them with hot sauce on newspaper napkins. This was a great and final, wild, uninhibited, Fellaheen, childlike city that we knew we would find at the end of the road. Dean walked through with his arms hanging zombie-like at his sides, his mouth open, his eyes gleaming, and conducted a ragged and holy tour that lasted till dawn in a field with a boy in a straw hat who laughed and chatted with us and wanted to play catch. For nothing ever ended. Then I got fever and became delirious and unconscious. Dysentery. I looked up out of the dark swirl of my mind and I knew I was on a bed 8,000 feet above sea level on a roof of the world, and I knew that I had lived a whole life and many others in the poor automistic husk of my flesh and had all the dreams. And I saw Dean bending over that kitchen table. It was several nights later and he was leaving Mexico City already. "What you doing, man?" I moaned. Poor Sal, got sick. Stan will take care of you now. Now listen to here if you can in your sickness. I got my divorce from Camille down here, and I'm driving back to Inez in New York tonight, if the car holds out. Oh, man, all that again? I cried. All that again, good buddy. Gotta get back to my life. Wish I could stay with you. Pray I can come back. I grabbed the cramps in my belly and groaned, and when I looked up again, bold, noble Dean was standing with his old broken trunk and looking down at me. I didn't know who he was anymore. And he knew this and sympathized with me and pulled the blanket over my shoulder. Yes. I've got to go now, old fever Sal, goodbye. And he was gone. 12 hours later, in my sorrowful fever, I came to understand that he was gone. By that time, he was driving back alone through those banana mountains, this time at night. When I got better, I realized what a rat he was. But then I had to understand the impossible complexity of his life, how he had to leave me there, sick, and to get on with his own wives and woes. Okay, old Dean, I'll say nothing.
Dean drove from Mexico City and saw Victor again in Georgia and pushed that old car all the way to Lake Charles, Louisiana, before the rear end finally dropped on the road as he had always known it would. So he wired Inez for airplane fare and flew the rest of the way. When he arrived in New York with the divorce papers in his hands, he and Inez immediately went to Newark and got married. And that night, telling her everything was all right and not to worry and making logics where there was nothing but inestimable, sorrowful sweats, he jumped on a bus and roared off again across the awful continent to San Francisco to rejoin Camille and the 2 baby girls. So now, he was 3 times married, twice divorced, and living with his second wife. In the fall, I myself started back home from Mexico City, and one night, just over Laredo border in Dilley, Texas, I was standing on the hot road underneath an arc lamp with the summer moth smashing into it when I heard the sound of footsteps from the darkness beyond. And lo, a tall old man with flowing white hair came clomping by with a pack on his back. And when he saw me, he passed, he said, "Go moan for man," and clomped on back to his dark. Did this mean that I should at least go on my pilgrimage on foot on the dark roads around America? I struggled and hurried to New York, and one night I was standing in a dark street in Manhattan and called up to the window of a loft where I thought my friends were having a party. But a pretty girl stuck her head out the window and said, "Yes, who is it?" "Sal Paradise," I said, and heard my name resound in the sad and empty street. "Come on up," she called. "I'm making hot chocolate." So I went up, and there she was, the girl with the pure and innocent dear eyes that I had always searched for, and for so long. We agreed to love each other madly. In the winter, we planned to migrate to San Francisco, bringing all our beat furniture and broken belongings with us in a jalopy panel truck. I wrote to Dean and told him. He wrote back a huge letter, 18,000 words long, all about his young years in Denver, and said he was coming to get me and personally select the old truck himself and drive us home. We had 6 weeks to save up the money for the truck and began working and counting every cent. And suddenly, Dean arrived anyway, 5.5 weeks in advance, and nobody had any money to go through with the plan. I was taking a walk in the middle of the night and came back to my girl to tell her what I thought about during my walk. She stood in the dark little pad with a strange smile. I told her a number of things, and suddenly I noticed the hush in the room and looked around and saw a battered book on the radio. I knew it was Dean's High Eternity in the Afternoon, Proust. As in a dream, I saw him tiptoe in from the dark hall in his stocking feet. He couldn't talk anymore. He hopped and laughed. He stuttered and fluttered his hands and said, you must listen to hear." We listened, all ears, but he forgot what he wanted to say. Really, listen, Look, dear Sal, sweet Laura, I've come, I'm gone, but wait, yes. And he stared with rocky sorrow into his hands. Can't talk no more. Do you understand that it is, or might be, but listen. We all listened. He was listening to sounds in the night. Yes, he whispered with awe. But you see, you no need to talk anymore. And further, but why did you come so soon, Dean? He said, looking at me as if for the first time. So soon? Yes. We'll know. That is, I don't know. I came on the railroad, past cabooses, old hard bench coaches. Texas played flute and wooden sweet potato all the way. He took out his new wooden flute. He played a few squeaky notes on it and jumped up and down in his stocking feet. See, he said, but of course, Sal, I can talk as soon as ever and have many things to say to you. In fact, with my own little bang-tailed mind, I've been reading and reading this gone, proused all the way across the country and digging a great number of things I'll never have time to tell you about, and we still haven't talked of Mexico and our parting there in fever. But no need to talk. Absolutely. Now, yes? All right, we won't talk. And he started telling the story of what he did in LA on the way over in every possible detail. How he visited a family, had dinner, talked to the father, the sons, the sisters, what they looked like, what they ate, their furnishings, their thoughts, their interests, their very souls. It took him 3 hours of detailed elucidation. And having concluded this, he said, but you see, what I wanted to really tell you, much later, Arkansas, crossing train, playing flute, play cards with boys, my dirty deck, won money, blue sweet potato solo for sailors, long, awful trip, 5 days and 5 nights, just to see you, Sal. What about Camille? Gave permission, of course, waiting for me. Camille and I, all straight forever and ever. And Inez, I want her to come back to Frisco with me, live other side of town, don't you think? Don't know why I came. Later he said, in a sudden moment of gaping wonder, well, and yes, of course, I wanted to see your sweet girl and you, glad of you, glad, love you as ever. He stayed in New York 3 days and hastily made preparations to get back on the train with his railroad passes and again recross the continent 5 days and 5 nights in dusty coaches and hard bench crummies. And of course, we had no money for a truck and couldn't go back with him. With Inez, he spent one night explaining and sweating and fighting, and she threw him out. A letter came from him, care of me. I saw it. It was from Camille. My heart broke when I saw you go across the tracks with your bag. I pray and pray you get back safe. I do want Sal and his friend to come and live on the same street. I know you'll make it, but I can't help worrying now that we've decided everything. Dear Dean, it's the end of the first half of the century. Welcome with love and kisses to spend the other half with us. We all wait for you. Signed, Camille, Amy, and little Joni. So Dean's life was settled with his most constant, most embittered, and best knowing wife, Camille. And I thanked God for him. The last time I saw him was under sad and strange circumstances. Remy Boncourt had arrived in New York after having gone around the world several times in ships. I wanted him to meet and know Dean. They did meet, but Dean couldn't talk anymore and said nothing, and Remy turned away. Remy had gotten tickets for Duke Ellington concert at the Metropolitan Opera and insisted Laura and I come with him and his girl. Remy was fat and sad now, but still the eager, formal gentleman, and he wanted to do things the right way, as he emphasized. So he got his bookie to drive us to the concert in a Cadillac. It was a cold winter night. The Cadillac was parked and ready to go. Dean stood outside the windows with his bag ready to go to Penn Station on across the land. "Goodbye, Dean," I said. "I sure wish I didn't have to go to the concert. Do you think I can ride to 40th Street with you?" He whispered. "Want to be with you as much as possible, my boy. And besides, it's so darn cold in this here New York." I whispered to Remy, no, he wouldn't have it. He liked me, but he didn't like my idiot friends. I wasn't going to start all over again, ruining his planned evenings as I had done at Alfred's in San Francisco in 1947 with Roland Major. Absolutely out of the question, Sal. Poor Remy. He had a special necktie made for the evening. On it was painted a replica of the concert tickets and the names Sal and Laura and Remy and Vicky, the girl, together with a series of sad jokes and some of his favorite sayings, such as, "You can't teach the old maestro a new tune." So Dean couldn't ride uptown with us. And the only thing I could do was sit in the back of the Cadillac and wave at him. The bookie at the wheel also wanted nothing to do with Dean. Dean, ragged in a moth-eaten overcoat he brought specially for the freezing temperatures of the East, walked off alone. And the last I saw of him, he rounded the corner of 7th Avenue, eyes on the street ahead, and bent to it again. Poor little Laura, my baby, to whom I've told everything about Dean, began almost to cry. "Oh, we shouldn't let him go like this. What do we do?" Old Dean's gone, I thought. And out loud I said, "He'll be all right." And off he went to the sad and disinclined, and off we went to the sad and disinclined concert for which I had no stomach whatever. And all the time I'm thinking of Dean and how he got back on that train and rode over 3,000 miles over that awful land and never knew why he had come anyway, except to see me. So in America, when the sun goes down and I sit on the old broken down river pier watching the long, long skies over New Jersey and sense all that raw land that rolls in one unbelievable huge bulge over the West Coast, and all that road going, all the people dreaming in the immensity of it. And in Iowa, I know by now the children must be crying in the land where they let the children cry. And tonight the stars will be out, and you don't know that God is Pooh Bear. The evening star must be drooping and shredding her sparkler dims on the prairie which is just before the coming of complete night that blesses the earth, darkens all rivers, cups the peaks, and folds in the final shore. And nobody knows what's going to happen besides the forlorn rags of growing old. I think of Dean Moriarty. I even think of old Dean Moriarty, the father we never found. I think of Dean Moriarty.
So much. And to our band again, and David Amram. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for being here today. Really, thank you all. You know, I was thinking that you know, we said 3:15. We said 5:15. It's 6 right now. So obviously this is the time to end. And again, I can't thank the artists enough, and also all of you for being here. Have a great evening, and thank you again.